Well, welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about Dickpocrisy and missile envy. The empire is falling fast. Won't spend too much time on this because I have two books I want to focus on, and I want two authors we want to focus on. So we're going to talk about what this means by saying Dickpocrisy and what does that mean? Well, with definitions, hypocrisy means the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to one's own behavior does not conform. So basically, you're telling other people to do some things, but you're not even living up to that. So that's what we say by hypocrisy. What's dickpocrisy? The practice of selecting and choosing highly ignorant, overwhelmingly entitled, and extremely inept people as respectable and responsible citizens. That's right. You chose what you got there in that White House. And now you got what you got. So I want to read from People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. You know, this book was banned by those people who are practicing dickpocrisy. They don't want this book being read in the school system. This is a wealth of information, extremely knowledgeable. So we're going to honor Howard Zinn by reading through his work. And also we're going to talk about a physician named Helen Caldicott, still living. Howard Zinn's deceased now, but she wrote a book called Missile Envy. So that's why I had that as part of the title for this brief presentation. So Howard Zinn wrote this book, and he has a chapter called A Kind of Revolution. And there's one component here on the Constitution, and I'm also going to read from a chapter that deals with war is the health of the state. But he says the Constitution then illustrates the complexity of the American system, that it serves the interests of a wealthy elite, but also does enough for small property owners, for middle-income mechanics, and farmers to build a broad sense of support. Now, it says it protects the elite. You see, the Constitution is now being ripped to shreds by this current government because they don't want the Constitution being reflected on you having your freedoms. The slightly prosperous people who make up this base, which Hillary Clinton had called the deplorables, are buffers against the blacks, the Indians, the poor whites. They enable the elite to keep control with a minimum of coercion, a maximum of law, all made palatable by the fanfare of patriotism and unity. Right now, we're in March. We're talking about the TSA people have shut down the airports because they're not working. So you now have this hypocrisy, so-called choice of choosing ICE agents to serve as TSA agents. Dickpocrisy at an all-time high. There's a chapter here on, look at this, even about the Sedition Act. So people want to talk about not funding and supporting these agents that are acting like slave patrollers. This is the Sedition Act of 1798, passed under John Adams' administration. This is 1798. 100 years ago, that is. A time when Irishmen and Frenchmen in the United States were looked on as dangerous revolutionaries because of the recent French Revolution and the Irish rebellions. The Sedition Act made it a crime to say or write anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the government, Congress, or the president, with intent to defame them, bring them to disrepute, or excite popular hatreds against them. I don't know if you heard about Afro Man in the media, but this brother made up a song about people who officers came to his house, bust up his door, took his money, and they never said sorry, gave things back. So he made some songs up about what happened. And so Afro Man was now able to use the freedom of speech, which the current government's trying to take away, to say he has the right to say what he wants to say, but he demoralized those officers who did him wrong. He didn't go into their house and bust up their house and take their money. No, they did it to him. They tried to sue him for making a song against that. So war comes in all levels. So war, there's something called propaganda. There's good propaganda, there's bad propaganda, but you're not seeing anything about what's happening over there in Iran. You're not seeing anything about people being killed. You're not seeing anything about devastation and destruction. People in the United States are isolated over here in this little turtle island place, so you're not seeing any war until bombs hit here, until destruction happens here. Then you wake up. So Howard Zinn's talking about war is the health of the state. It says back home. This is now during one of the I think World War One. Back home, the British were not told of the slaughter. One English writer recalled the most bloody defeat in the history of Britain might occur, and our press come out bland and copious and graphic with nothing to show that we had not had quite a good day. A victory, really? The same thing was happening on the German side. As Eric Maria Remarque wrote in his great novel, on days when men by the thousands were being blown apart by machine guns and shells, the official dispatches announced, quote, all quiet on the Western Front. You're not seeing and hearing about what's happening. Devastation and destruction happening all over. And so when you look at the way that we're being manipulated by not understanding that this war, can't call it a war. I guess you call it a war because you now started something, you bomb people, but Congress did not approve this. So we have a situation where you have a dictator, Dickpocrisy, leading the way for a World War III. Another little component here says, the government, this is about 1917, the government quickly succeeded in creating such a consensus according to traditional histories. Woodrow Wilson's biographer, Arthur Link, wrote, in the final analysis, American policy was determined by the president and public opinion. So you got a fool now making you think that this place called Iran was a problem for you. You got a fool now saying that this leader of another country was part of a cartel. You got a fool leading you into these excursions abroad, and it's creating danger for everybody. In fact, there is no way a measuring public opinion at that time, and there's no persuasive evidence that the public wanted war, just like today. The government had to work hard to create a consensus. This is now 1917. That there was no spontaneous urge to fight is suggested by the strong measures taken, a draft of young men, an elaborate propaganda campaign throughout this country, and harsh punishment for those who refused to get in line. Again, draft then, thinking draft now. Despite the rousing words of Wilson about a war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy, like make America great again, Americans did not rush to enlist. 1 million men were needed, but the first 6 weeks after the declaration of war, only 73,000 volunteered. Congress voted overwhelmingly for a draft. It's going to happen again. It's now 2026. It's going to happen again because of this unjust war. So Howard Zinn, got to remember him. Eldon Caldecott, she's an anti-nuclear activist, founder of the Nuclear Power Research Institute and president of the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Wrote this book called Missile Envy. Missile Envy, it says the arms race and nuclear war. I have the 1986 revised edition. If you get a chance, you can hear her words on the internet. I'm going to play a little bit for you today and conclude on that. But listen to some of her words. This is on a chapter called Etiology. That means the cause of. Etiology. Missile envy and other psychopathology. In my regressive moods, I often have thought that if Martians invaded Earth, all nations would unite in a self-righteous comradeship to do battle with aliens. I find this interesting because I'm going to do another presentation on aliens, troglodytes, and the pale fox, because I'm going to really talk about what if aliens really came in? What would really happen? Are we going to be interested and intrigued, or are we going to like, oh no, invaders coming and shoot and not even know what we're doing? These people may be coming to bring some way of dealing with a better civilization. So our mindset of fearing the other, the xenophobic mentality, is problematic. She says, no person on earth is totally rational. All human behavior is motivated to some degree by primitive emotional responses and reactions. We have been conditioned to fear, hate, feel jealous, or to respond in other ways to certain stimuli. That's what I'm saying, how we respond to some aliens that came on down. Many of our emotions have their origins in childhood. That's why she talks about missile envy, the way that Freud as a psychoanalytic expert talked about penis envy. So Oedipus complex, Electra complex, talked about these things in childhood that dictated why people did certain things in their older age. We also tend to project our feelings of inadequacy, fear, or hatred onto other people. Ronald Reagan told me during a meeting in the White House that the Soviets are evil, godless communists. When I asked him if he had ever met one, he said no. That is an example of Mr. Reagan projecting his fear and hatred into the Soviets. The nasty side of people is called our dark side. So she's really breaking down and explaining this mindset that we have right now in the White House with this Dickpocrisy is creating havoc for the world. We do not want to lead to something called nuclear war, but you don't even think about it because you're in your little isolated places in your world and not understanding that the devastation could impact all and we may not ever exist again. She says, a man named Mark Gerzon recently wrote a book called A Choice of Heroes, in which he examines the state of the world. He determines that it is in a serious dilemma, and that certainly in the United States, decisions are made by a small minority, white Anglo-Saxon males, middle-aged and older. Because these people have created such enormous problems, Mr. Gerzon asserts, that we need to examine their psychological pathology. Typically, these men never show emotion, never admit mistakes, and are very dependent on others of the same sex for peer group approval. They are always sure of themselves, they are always right, and above all, they are always tough and strong. He suggests that in the nuclear age, these men need to redefine strength and courage for themselves to become men who have the courage to show weaknesses and fallibilities, to admit mistakes, to show emotion, even to cry when appropriate. So we have a psychopath running the government, and this is not going to happen. It takes extraordinary strength and inner courage for a man to be able to do this. A weak, unattractive man never shows any emotion or even admits to having emotions, never is fallible, never admits to making a mistake, hides behind his defense mechanism, and builds missiles. So we think we can bomb our way out of this predicament we're in. Not so much we, but the government in the United States shutting down and not having access to resources anymore, the dollar being almost decimated. We have problems with the economy. And so what do? You create war elsewhere to divert attention away from the social responsibilities that should be going on in this country. So I'm going to play a little bit of Helen Caldicott so you can kind of feel and see that this woman has fought her life. This is a March, so it's what, still Women's History Month? We're going to talk about what this woman has done and committed her life to try to help us out to fight against these, again, people that are trying to destroy the world.
William Jefferson Clinton. Now, Clinton is a very intelligent man with great charisma. However, he's got no courage and he wasn't a true leader. So what he did when he got elected was set up a nuclear posture review headed by former Senator Les Aspin. Aspin looked at the data and he saw that as they dropped the bombs, Moscow just turned into a huge blaze of red. There are about 60 hydrogen bombs targeted on Moscow because they have a plan in the military called SIOP, Single Integrated Operational Plan, where as the weapons were pumped out of the labs and the corporations, junior officers, never did the president oversee this planning and targeting strategy, nor the senior officers. It was junior officers. It was almost pin the tail on the donkey. We'll drop one there and we'll do. There was such a redundancy of weapons. Railway stations, railroad crossings were targeted, shoe factories, anything the enemy holds most dear, America puts at risk. And as one person said in the military, I don't care what the enemy holds most dear, if he, and it's always a he, notice, values grandmothers, we target grandmothers. And I was particularly offended by that statement because I'm a grandmother. So during the Cold War, PSYOP had 2,500 targets in Russia. There are only 240 major cities in the Northern Hemisphere, okay? But since Then, since the Cold War ended, they've now got 3,000 targets. China's targeted for the first time for a long time. Russia and Australia's terribly targeted because we've got 34 US military bases, including the biggest CIA base in the world that orchestrated this terrible thing in Iraq. And then Les died of a heart attack. Les said, we don't need the weapons, we're going to get rid of them. And he had a compliant man in the Kremlin called Yeltsin, who was a hardened alcoholic and really wasn't capable of doing much except he did work with the United States. Then a young man called Ashton Carter got into office. Now, this is all written in a book by Jane Nolan, which I've referenced because I always wondered what happened. And Ashton Carter was young, altruistic, and no match for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they brutalised him the way the White House has been brutalising Colin Powell. Because you see, if you've worked at Harvard and I suppose Berkeley or in the hospitals or wherever, there's always a hierarchical structure. And those on the top, usually males, are the most brutal. And they brutalise each other. And I've seen it in medicine so often, but that's what's happening in the White House. So Ashton Carter was brutalised. They said they called ash to the carpet. And at the end of the posture review, nothing changed. The weapons were still on hair trigger alert. America's still got a policy to fight and win a nuclear war against Russia, lo and behold. And at the end, one general was heard to say, if you threaten our missiles and our early warning system, baby, that's threatening the family jewels, which I think is the most significant thing I'm going to say tonight, because the cause of this nuclear madness is the reptilian midbrain. And to compare the missiles to the male genitalia, I mean, there's some deep psychological pathology in that. And if you look at the Pentagon language, it's replete with sexual innuendos. Missile erectors, soft laydowns, deep penetration, hard lines, soft lines. We'll have a nuclear war like one big orgasmic wump. That's how they talk. In front of women on a stage, you know. They've got no shame or embarrassment. That's how it's like sports language. And I'll get into the etiology or cause of killing later that I've tried to analyse. So the weapons are still in place. America's got 2,500 on hair trigger alert and Russia's got 2,500. And because, let me walk you through how America will fight and win a nuclear war. You knock out their eyes and ears, which are the satellites with infrared detectors which pick up the flame from the missiles. You knock out the command centre in Moscow. Then you launch your missiles. You've got over 3,000 hydrogen bombs on your Trident subs at sea at any one time, roving around quietly. And a commander, if he became psychotic and convinced his crew, can launch his missiles without communicating with the Pentagon. And they're only about 15 minutes away from Russia. So you launch them and your Minutemen missiles with 3 hydrogen bombs in them. The Trident missiles have 8 hydrogen bombs. It's called MIRVing, Multiple Independent Re-Entry Vehicle. And they're so accurate and guided by the GPS satellites that they land right on top of the missile silos and, quotes, kill the missiles. People are disassembled. People are seen as objects and they don't have any humanity, and millions of people being killed in such an attack is called collateral damage by the Pentagon. Now the fact then, if you miss a few and Russia launches them and gets them up, you're setting up a missile defence to shoot them down, and there are various stages of the missile defence: boost phase, transit phase, terminal phase and the like. I can go into that, but it's all in the book. So then you've won the nuclear war. You've killed their missiles. Now, because the Russians don't want their missiles killed and they think like your military do, madmen they are, they would launch their weapons to make sure your missiles hit empty silos. The trouble is 1,000 bombs dropping on 100 cities creates nuclear winter and the end of life on Earth. And we're talking about 5,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. So, and how does nuclear winter occur? The cities burn with a huge cloud of toxic black smoke which roils up and covers the earth so thick with a cloud it blocks out the sun for a year. And we sort of saw this recently in Australia, where we had the most ghastly bushfires and the sky in the middle of the day was navy blue and purple, full of smoke. And I said to my friend, this is like nuclear winter. There was no sunlight photosynthesis ceases, and most of the 30 million species on the planet that cohabit with us will die, and we will too. And that'll be the end of Shakespeare and Brahms and Mozart and Beethoven and the rest, Picasso, Rembrandt. But it's all right because the nuclear war is won. Now, the Russians are suitably paranoid about this policy, as one would be. And because their satellites now only work 8 hours a day, because they're all falling apart, they're decrepit, they can't afford to keep their satellites and early warning system going, they get very jumpy. And it's clinically contraindicated to threaten a paranoid patient because they often do something really dangerous and threaten you, and people who've worked with patients know that. So one day in January 1995, Norway launched a missile, an old American missile with a weather satellite on top. Now, the Pentagon had told the Kremlin that was going to happen, but the Kremlin lost the papers. If you've been to Russia, they're a bit hopeless. You're really organised. Bang, 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 bang. Probably the most organised nation in the world, maybe apart from the Germans. But the Russians are sort of hopeless, and they lost the stuff. So the missile's launched, and they pick up the telemetry from the missile and the fire from the missile with the infrared satellite, and they say, oh my God, we're under attack. That loop takes 15 minutes. The missiles land in 30. So there's Yeltsin, hardened alcoholic, maybe 2 bottles of vodka a day, Wernicke's encephalopathy, Korsakoff syndrome. They open the football for the first time in the history of the nuclear age in Russia. Hands up those who don't know what the football is. Oh, well, remember when Reagan was shot? They always carry a case. An aide always carries a case behind the president with the nuclear codes in it, so if necessary, he can press the button and blow up the planet. When Reagan was shot, they lost the football for 2 days. They didn't know where it was. Remember Alexander Haig said, I'm in charge now? Do you remember that? Well, so here's Yeltsin sitting before the football opened. His general standing over his shoulder, and he had a 3-minute time frame to press the button before his missiles would be killed, and he obviously didn't want that to happen. 10 seconds before that time elapsed, the missile veered off course.
Those words were 23 years ago. If you do not read history, you are doomed to repeat it.